and welcome to another edition of From Ireland to Palestine. This week's guest is Chris Agee. He's the editor of the Irish Pages, which is a biannual journal featuring writing from Ireland and elsewhere. In recent years, they've moved into publishing books with the Irish Pages Press. And notably for us, that means they've published Avi Shlaim's most recent book entitled Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War on Palestine. So he's here with us to talk about the book itself, its suppression in the media, and how writing, art, literature can contribute to the Palestinian cause. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Patrick, for having me. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about Avi Shlaim's book. And I have to say right at the start, I'm a bit daunted because this book is so well written and so brilliant, both academically and stylistically, even in literary terms, that I'm not sure I can do it justice just summarizing. So I might quote from it from time to time, but delighted to be here.
Oh, thanks for coming. So you've lived in Ireland for 45 years, but you, as your accent suggests, you grew up in the United States.
I grew up in the States, came here when I was 23, having been here in the north of Ireland in 77, 78. I intended to stay a year or two. I was very interested in Irish literature and, of course, Seamus Heaney, and one thing led to another. My wife is from Armagh, my son is Irish, and my daughter was Irish too. So, I got here and I stayed. And I'm rather happy now with this lunatic in the White House that I am here in Ireland. And even the north of Ireland, which I always, I had mixed feelings about, let's be honest. I wrote an essay called Troubled Belfast.
There's elements of lunacy here as well.
Yeah. But the lunacy is more or less suppressed now. And now, as Heaney said just before he died, the world is becoming a big Ulster. So a lot of these hugely, ethnic tensions and all this, some of the craziness we saw here in a microcosm is now spread to the world. So I'm actually very happy to be in Belfast, in a nice leafy Belfast, South Belfast house, which is not costing a fortune like in New York or Boston, etc. Yeah. So I've reconciled myself to this place, to the home place. So, I'm an Irish citizen, I must say. Always have been.
I hope so, if you've lived here for 45 years. Okay.
Yeah, but an American citizen.
They would grant you that.
Yeah. Well, they did. Yeah.
So, growing up in the US, what shaped your political development? What influenced you politically?
Well, I grew up early in Boston. My father was at law school. But my main core experience was in a small town right on the edge of New York called Bronxville, just outside the Bronx. Which was really the worst kind of suburban life, a little bit like The Graduate, if you ever watched that.
Yeah,
it was shades of The Graduate, no doubt. That's all I can say. Then I went to boarding school, which was a liberation, and then I went to Harvard, which was like slave labor, academic slave labor. I didn't enjoy it as much as boarding school, and that kind of formed me. But I can say right away that I had no real sense of Israel. Although I had a huge sense of Judaism, of course, growing up in New York. So that, in a way now, in retrospect, informs me because Judaism, of course, it's a religion, where Zionism is a secular political ideology. And you could make a slight comparison between Catholicism and the Republican movement. They overlap, but they're not the same, for sure. So that is my early experience, which is very, very familiar with Judaism. In New York. I mean, at that time it was about 25-30% Jewish. And some of my, if I can say as a slight joke, some of my best friends were Jewish, literally. And I had a great girlfriend who was Jewish, etc. So, my realization about Israel came later.
So, I mean, obviously the US has been a close ally of Israel for a long time, particularly after the 1967 war. So, and you left the U.S. in
1979 permanently. I came in 77, 78. I worked in Ardoyne one summer and other places in working class Belfast. The play schemes, the children's schemes. I was involved in that. So.
Do you think you've seen a shift in U.S. policies since that time, like the attitude of the U.S. public and?
I think the attitude has slowly evolved, especially under scholars under the influence of scholars like Avi Shlaim. But now with this war, there's deep alienation in the Jewish community in America, probably at least, I would say 60%, 70%, 75% are very unhappy with the war. Younger generation almost entirely. So there's been a big shift. But your questions sent to me last night sort of prompted me to think about what I knew about Israel, if you want to put it that way, all the way up to, the peace accords, Camp David peace accords with Carter and Begin. That sort of impacted on me. Before that, two things come to mind. One, a very close friend at boarding school, whose father was Adam Lerner, his name was. His father was a famous liberal Jewish columnist. And I remember him saying about 1967 that his older brother immediately got on the plane to Israel after the Six-Day War started. But he didn't get there in time. He got stuck in an airport. But I didn't think of anything of that. It seemed natural, so like even the liberal Kennedys were very pro-Palestinian. So it was just part of the idea that Israel was a doughty little state surrounded.
It was kind of a positive view to some extent.
Neutral to positive. I mean, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about the Palestinians.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever made the parallel, which is now quite common in my thinking, between the Native Americans who were exterminated by European settler colonialism.
Yeah.
And now I have and what was happening in Israel. So basically, I accepted completely the Israeli narrative implicitly. I didn't think about it. Whereas in other respects, I was very liberal, like the civil rights movement, right? Part of my family, blood family, my nephews are African Americans. And one of the big influences on me was Malcolm X. I still love him,
Yeah.
But thinking about Israel, far away, country of which I know nothing about.
Yeah. Still, there's an element that people talk about, that acronym PAFP, Progressive Apart from Palestine.
Yeah,
so
basically,
something about
that's
along those
basically
lines.
what I was.
Yeah.
I did have, so the change came, we can come to this, in 1982, where I lived in Israel, Palestine and Israel for an entire summer. But your question prompted something that happened to me in 1975 when I was studying for a year in Aix-en-Provence in Paris, or in France. And this was, in retrospect, my first dramatic confrontation even, or experience of settler colonialism. And I can tell you about that because I'm looking back now, and that really was something. If you wish, I can tell you about this little brief story.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Aix-en-Provence, the height of multiculturalism. Arabs, Iranians. My best friend was Faridun from Tehran, probably long ago passed away because he was in the Communist Party, and so forth. Arabs from Maghreb, Syria. I knew everybody. I knew at least two or three people from every major Arab country. They were pouring into France, post-colonial, especially Algerians. I was trying to learn Arabic even. The teacher was from Cairo. She didn't wear, of course, a hijab. She had a nice Irish Aran sweater. And we had the class at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was great. I got a real insight into the Arab world. So that was a sort of starting point of thinking a little bit differently. But then some Swedish friends, and most of my circle somehow was from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, even the Faroe Islands. Someone goes, there's some kind of Israeli party out in the woods. Let's go. And I go, okay. Why is it out in the woods? I don't know. It's just like what was happening in X, all sorts of things.
Maybe the best part of Lansdale.
Women in the cafe, and, we didn't do any dope or anything like that, although that was quite common in boarding school. But, it was fun. There were parties everywhere, like out in the country. So someone says, let's go to the countryside. So we went, and I never forget going over the hill. And I go, what are these people? Who are these people? Because they were all dressed in fatigues. They were all dressed in retrospect, I saw it later, they were all in IDF uniforms. What are they doing in the middle of France? Is this even legal? Right? So I now think that they were dressed as reservists because most citizens, wherever they go, they have to have.
It's So I didn't even know that. I didn't know that when they're outside Israel. I've heard things like that. They have to carry their rifle with them everywhere when they're in Israel.
There may have even been a guy with a rifle. I can't quite remember. So I'm saying, whoa, this is completely out of keeping with X, laid back people from Arab world just violate every principle that is now held about Muslim people and so forth. I felt, possibly due to the fact my French was good, but not that good, I felt pretty shunned and excluded as a Gentile, clear Gentile. And having had a lot of experience of my Jewish friends, that was really weird. Now, most of them, I believe, were speaking Hebrew, of course, but some spoke French. So there were French Jews there, all kitted out. And I remember like a couple hours of really uncomfortable feeling because I talked with one guy. I can't quite remember whether he was French Jew or Israeli. I believe him to be Israeli, a Sabra, like native. And he was so aggressive about this. I'm going, like, I don't know anything, but he's super aggressive. And he just talked at me. I would guess now ideologically, and it didn't make, I couldn't put it together with my experience of Jewish friends. This is like some really extreme crowd. And I think the Swedes felt the same thing. Although the 2 or 3 Swedes were women. I think there were, like 4 Swedish. One was a friend of mine, mate Ernst Brunner, subsequently became a very famous Swedish writer. And the other 3 were like Swedish blondes. And, everybody was attracted. It was mostly male, but not entirely. I just was so alienated for 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 hours. And now, settler colonialism. That's what it was. This was a complete mentality, and they were kind of there, cut off from, the surrounding culture and just pushing this thing at us.
Sort of domineering attitude.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, you're talking about someone who was essentially, unthinkingly, Israel's okay,
We've seen a lot of those clips, like since, obviously, well over the years, but especially since October the 7th, we have seen something similar to what you described, Israelis
jumping around, celebrating
maybe
Amalek,
maybe going to Thailand and places like that, and behaving in a very boorish fashion to restaurant owners and so on there, acting like they own the place. When sometimes restaurant owners ask them to leave and then they refuse to and say they've, my money here pays for your house.
It's kind of impunity. Yeah. But now I look back, I can't say that everybody there was like this, but the guy I was talking with was certainly, and I did feel that essentially I was a Gentile, an American, they're not going to be too courteous to me. And I didn't mind that. I just was stunned by these military fatigues, which part of me thought, maybe it's illegal, to wear because it is illegal in Ireland, I believe, to wear another uniform. Sure, you can't. You can wear the IDF, Irish Defense Forces uniform, but nothing else. And that's a problem with Americans going through Shannon. So anyway, it was very interesting. And now thinking back to my early life, many Jewish friends in New York and Boston. And this thing arrived from Israel. And it was frightening, actually personally frightening. And I would not have been frightened about anything else in Aix-en-Provence. It was like, great, we're having fun.
Yeah.
They're not having fun. Anyway.
You learned, I say, you were in Palestine in 82, an important year, obviously, in the conflict, because that was the Israel-Lebanon so-called war. It was more like another attempted genocide or beginning of a genocide there.
Yeah, it was,
but you were in the West Bank, was that right?
Yeah, so that was interesting. Why did I go back to, so I'm here in Ireland, I'm here a few years. I just gotten my stamp on my passport before I got my Irish passport to stay, thanks to Jerry Fitt, who somehow justified my presence in Northern Ireland, being helping communities or something. And I liked him personally, whatever you think of his politics. And I remember I met him once in his house in Antrim Road. And we were talking, and I was thanking him, because he owed the British Home Secretary for the hunger strikes,
Yeah,
right? So I was thinking, thank you for this. I don't know what the political context is, although I did. And you were good to me, and I'm glad to stay now. And we're standing there. I'll never forget this. This is like the other little episodes that become microcosms, speaking to bigger picture. Some boys on the Antrim Road, he had this sort of old-fashioned house, and they're walking by, and of course his windows were like bulletproof plastic, and we're looking out the window, and they start throwing stones immediately, which I saw. I used to work in West Belfast all the time as a lecturer in literacy, so I know Springfield Road very well. I know West Belfast. I know East Belfast. I know everywhere. I used to go into youth training programs. And these guys throw the stones, little boys, 10, 11, and Jerry goes, "Soldiers of Ireland." It was funny. And I said, yeah, okay. So that's Jerry Fitt done. And after I got sort of settled here, I sort of looked forward to Aix-en-Provence, which is in the south of France, of course. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, yeah, it might be fun to Israel-Palestine, because I saw an advertisement from the British, I think it was through the British Museum or something, for an archaeological dig in Palestine, Israel. You get there, they feed you, you become a slave laborer, and you work in the sun. So I went there for a summer, and that was I call it, in this essay I wrote about Palestine being there in 1982, I called it the blessed breaker. It broke the narrative. I started to see what was really happening. And it was great. It was beautiful. So it was in a place called Latrun. People who know Palestine will know exactly what I mean. It's a salient that goes the furthest west in Palestine. It's a small salient into Israel. It was recognized by the 49 armistice, and there was a big battle in 48 there with a tank, the Arab Legion from Jordan, and Israeli tanks, and the Arabs actually won this one. And Latrun was very, very interesting. It has a huge Trappist monastery with a vast olive grove. It had some buildings next door, and the whole thing was being run by the French archaeological mission to Palestine. So they had it all organized. Arab workers, Mizrahi, Arab Jews in the kitchen, all run by Ashkenazi, all run by European Israelis. They were the boss then. And I suppose another little anecdote, which reveals everything. So most of the people there were French Jews. There were some Brits, a couple Americans, and it was a really good time. We were staying in tents, We had discos in ancient caves and stuff. It was really good. So one day I'm talking with Michael, who's the Ashkenazi director. Of course, he has an Uzi on his table, which was a little bit unusual for an archaeological zone. Yeah. He's got that machine gun on his table, and he's wearing this hat that I still have, a hat, kind of green hat. It's called in Israel, a Jewish friend of mine told me much later, it's called an idiot's hat, right? It's not floppy, but it's great. One, yeah. And then, it's no air conditioning. He's sort of probably talking about Israel, this, that, and the other. I was maybe listening. I was cooling off. So next door, right out the door, there's a vineyard. And I take about 10 steps, and this guy shows up. He doesn't say anything for 3 words. Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. He's poor. It's clear. His shirt's ripped. At that point, the PLO in 1982 wasn't, especially present in anybody's consciousness. They were up in Beirut. And he is a dispossessed person. I can see it right away. So it was all there. The European presence in the archaeological mission, the volunteers, the Arab Jews, Mizrahi, some of them were from Yemen, some were from, believe it or not, India, and then the Ashkenazis running a whole show. So it was like a vision. That whole place was a vision of Israel in 1982. And the occupation, although present, was, compared to now, was just light, Lite, So
Wasn't checkpoints everywhere. There wasn't a big
No.
apartheid wall.
no, none of that.
No.
Okay, so last little anecdote from the period, and we can talk about the wider picture. Believe it or not, Latrun, so the dig was actually in Israel. So every morning at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, you used to take a bus into Israel, Bet Shemesh, which was like this new, dusty, totally undistinguished Israeli immigrant, as someone, as David Grossman said very unfortunately recently, as big criticism in the States, that this is the startup nation. It was like a startup town, right?
Yeah, that's how I like to characterize themselves.
Yeah. So, Arab is meaningless, Arab culture. So in the morning, there was a Muslim worker or Arab worker next to me explaining Islam with the dawn coming up, and I got a glimpse of from the inside what it means from an inside believer who's not in any sense extremist. So we'd do the dig, and then in the evenings, we'd sleep in the afternoon, and then, unbelievably, we hitchhiked into Jerusalem, about 20 kilometers, and hitchhiked back. So it wasn't Jerusalem days that I remember, it's Jerusalem nights, and there was no checkpoints. There might have been some in the city. There would be an IDF guy driving home or something. He put Arabs in. He put everybody. There's a lot of backpackers. And there wasn't any sense of the same kind of occupation. Because at that point in 1982, there may be 75,000, 100,000 settlers. It wasn't like this at all.
Yeah, it was like 700,000.
And it's also the period that Avi comes from, which is the new historian period.
That was when I was breaking through, wasn't it, that time in the early 80s?
Because people started to think about, okay, they've been in Camp David Accords, and there was a general idea, a general support, especially in the Labor Party, sort of, for supposedly a two-state solution. So it was kind of moderate, occupation-light situation. I really didn't see any IDF except the ones that picked up the hitchhikers. But as we were digging in the hole, various holes in this city that was 2,000, 3,000 BC, ancient Bronze Age, before Israeli Jews or Arabs were even a glint in anybody's eye. It was Sharon's expedition into Beirut. And we listened, and it got more and more brutal. So that's the first real, then Sabra and Shatia, I believe I'm pronouncing, was between 5,000 and 6,000 people killed under the inspection of the Israelis. It was phalangists in Lebanon, but with their approval. And our friend Sean, who was the UN person, Sean McBride, did an investigation.
Described it as a genocide, yeah.
Form of genocide. So there it was, 1982, a kind of prophecy foretold. The situation was extremism within Likud, which is starting to build up big time, and that's Netanyahu's party.
Yeah.
And so that was my view, and so my feeling for Palestine, extremely beautiful country, not at all what comes through with rioting in Ramallah, more or less as different as Belfast backstreets, rioting and burning, and the Irish countryside, it's different.
Yeah.
So that's my little vision, and then ever since then, I've been very alert, very attentive to what's happening in the Middle East, often comparing what's happening in the streets of Belfast around the hunger strike, and I was there after the hunger strike, but the violence, the way the British Army handled things versus the IDF, which has always been out of control. So I became very alert to Palestine.
Yeah. So moving on a bit then to the Irish Pages itself and the book, maybe tell us a bit about what the Irish Pages is, when it started, and then the move into publishing.
Okay. We did, so Irish Pages, the journal, full name, Irish Pages, A Journal of Contemporary Writing, started in 2003 with my co-editor, Cathal Sharkey, is one of the great Irish language poets, and we just started it as a kind of literary enterprise.
Yeah.
And it just got bigger and bigger and more complex. And we're funded by the North and South Arts Councils. And we've always said right from the beginning, it's a bilingual journal, and it's an all-Ireland journal. And our Irish, one of our supporters, we always characterize him as a managing editor, but he didn't do too much managing. He did all the translation. Sean McAndressa. His mission in life was the preservation and extension of the Irish language. And along with Liam Carson, Kieran's father, they founded, Shaw's Road. Mm-hmm. And he worked for us a lot, did a lot of translations, and it was a real gift to work with him. He was married, if you will, to the Irish language. Nothing was too much late night. And he wasn't that interested in writing. And I remember in Cultureland, I was talking to him and saying, you should write all these stories you're telling me about crossing the border during partition, the little triangle that you needed and stuff. And he goes, I have no messages.
Right. It's just about spreading the language, basically.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a message in itself, I suppose.
It is.
Yeah.
And then he told the tale, very brief, that his brother, who was killed in an IRA training event, training accident, 71, 72. And so his brother was active. He wasn't. He stayed away from that, or whatever he thought, he kept to himself, which is great. Sean and another guy are walking down the falls. It's some kind of mayhem going on, right? Burning cars. And they run into an IRA figure. I have no idea who it is. And they go in Irish, because this guy probably learned his Irish in prison. They go, in Irish, what are you doing for the Irish language? Mm-hmm. And the IRA guy, 100% certain, goes, don't worry about the Irish language. First of all, we have to get liberation. Then we'll deal with the Irish language. Mm-hmm. And Sean said, we simply say, fuck off, in Irish. We can't wait for political unification. Irish language comes first. Just like Marcino Kine said, the famous, West of Ireland writer, prose writer, he wrote a pamphlet.
It's low-hanging fruit, isn't it? It's like it's something you can actually do right there and then.
Right.
That's what we always say.
You're just telling us to,
something you can do right then. Just go ahead and do it.
They literally went feck off and walked away. And Marcino Kine, the famous Irish language writer, who finally was recognized and became a professor of Irish towards the end of his life, he died in 1971. He wrote a really good essay, Irish Above Politics. Mm-hmm. Anyway, sorry for the. You can cut it all out.
Then you moved into publishing, and so the reason you're on today, obviously, is because of Avi Shlaim's book. So maybe if you speak a bit about that, did he have difficulty finding a publisher for it, and then you came along?
A little bit of background. We've done all sorts of issues on, Empire. We did one on Iraq. Empire. The first issue was called Belfast in Europe, inaugural issue. We did memory. We did inheritance. We always have a theme, although they're not exclusive. And about 10 years ago, we did Israel, Islam in the West. Mm-hmm. And we got Avi. I don't know how I got him exactly, but probably I read his famous book, The Iron Wall, which has, restructured the way people look at the Zionist experience in 2002. It's had a huge influence. Mm. It's what I call intellectual infrastructure. So we can come back to that and activism. Then I called him up. After that, it was quite successful. We sold out completely. We packed out 7 venues, Smock Alley Theater, 250 people showed up and ran out of copies and so forth. So we've always been there. Although some people in the pro-Palestine movement kept asking, well, why didn't you mention Palestine on the cover? Israel, Islam in the West. Because Palestine's not the problem. The problem is Israel, Islam to a certain degree, like in the sense of extremist, and the West above all. So it was a litany of the problems. But it had it was reviewed and all that sort of stuff. So when this thing started, we called up Avi, my son Jacob and I, who works with me, and we pitched it to him. Do a book on Gaza. And he said, I can't possibly do a book on Gaza. I mean, I don't have enough time. He's totally overwhelmed, even now more than ever with this book, overwhelmed by invitations. But what I can do is I can give you 10 of the essays that I've written over 20 years on Gaza, which is like a tragedy foretold. And I can write 3 or 4 more. And that's what it is. It's a collection of essays, and with a preface by Francesca Albanese, talking about what an honor it is.
Who's a UN Special Rapporteur.
Yeah, a UN Special Rapporteur on occupied territories, death threats, everything. And she says it's a huge but tragic honor to write this forward of several pages, which is in the book. And then we decided we're going to make this an Irish book as a kind of lesson to England that we can do this, but you can't. And it's clear that they weren't going to probably buy this idea. But Avi just said yes. And we put Blinnian Crawley, who is the barrister who presented the case against Israel for South Africa. And, as everybody knows, her presentation went viral completely. And I looked at it and said, my father and my grandfather were lawyers. This is not only a great piece of law, it is actually a very good literary piece of writing. So we put it as a coda. So it's very much an Irish book. And Avi's going around saying, this is my Irish book. But he didn't go to an English publisher because we convinced him that it would make a bigger splash in Ireland and then it would reverse the new normal thing. It would go back to England rather than this idea that London publishing, we all buy down. So I'm very happy, and it's proved to be the case. We've got, quite a lot of publicity in Ireland, zero in they're shunning them.
We'll come on to that, but I think you've got a few quotes there you want to pick out as sort of the major themes of the...
Okay. So what Avi says sometimes in the big interview he did with the Irish News, which was 2 pages unprecedented, he said, borrowing from a friend of mine, I must say, Ireland is the natural ally of all anti-colonial struggles. If you see that the Republic is different, it doesn't share great power thinking. When the Israeli ambassador left Dublin and more or less verbally spit in the eye of President Higgins, they said Ireland is pro-international law, pro-peace, pro-human rights. Now, David Lammy and Keir Starmer, forget about Starmer, my nephews would have a problem with David Lammy as African Americans. He is basically Uncle Tom. Okay, he just does the colonial thinking. Right? He won't say anything. He knows it's bad. And this is the problem with Britain. They can't break out of this structure, this addiction to Israel. And Lammy, who used to vilify, Trump and said very critical things about even Israel in the past, he's just holding his line. And this is not happening in Ireland. So the book has, if I may say so, we've gone into the 2nd edition, and we're about to have to go into the 3rd edition. We've sold something like nearly 3,500 copies in 3 months. It's totally unprecedented. We have 11 languages seeking translation rights. We can't cope with it. We had to give it to an agent. The book has taken us from a small, respected and good press, Irish press, based in the north, to like a middle-ranking press. And we think that the book will just, unfortunately, sell as long as this happens. So a couple passages.
Yeah. Something to draw attention to there. Yeah, go ahead.
I tend to be speaking a lot here, but I suppose that's why
That's why you're on.
So I like anecdotes. Of course, I'm a poet. I look at microcosm, looking at the big picture. Now, Avi's book is extremely good piece of scholarship. And if anybody buys a book, I would recommend they immediately go to a recent essay, 2 recent essays, Balfour and the Nakba, A History of Betrayal, which is really surprising about what Britain has done from day one. to the one that is just outstanding, which is called Israel's Road to Genocide. It's done with a co-author, Jamie Weinerstern, who is his PhD student. It has 100, 210 footnotes. And what it analyzes is all the calls for extermination and expulsion, not done by the, there's plenty of people doing it in the Israeli population, but from government ministers and the press. So that's well worth reading.
It's a never-ending list of quotes, and then the likes of the BBC.
Yeah, it goes on and on and on. But the thing about Avi, and this is what's daunting, so the scholarship is impeccable. He's been doing this for 30 or 40 years. He started in our archives in the 80s as one of the new historians with Benny Morris, who's now extreme right-wing, and Ilan Pape, who's stayed the course. He got into the archives, and he saw that, in fact, 48 was a massive piece of ethnic cleansing. Okay, Nakba did involve some people fleeing of their own will, but he got radicalized by that, and he turned from studying in Oxford. He ended up as professor and head of the Department of International Relations. He's now professor emeritus. He moved from what I would gather now is a kind of boring topic, which was EU law, EU unification. He got more and more interested in this because of his early life. He was born in Iraq. He moved to Israel when he was 5, and he grew up there. And he came to England for education, Cambridge, LSE. So to resume the thread, what is so impressive is his mastery as a pure scholar, unparalleled in any place in the Anglophone world. He has the details. He has the archives. He has the citations. He has what absolutely destroys the narrative, the Zionist narrative. But then he summarizes in absolutely brilliant literary historical writing. Remember that in the ancient world, history was considered one of the 7 arts, Clio. And he kind of raises historical writing to an art form. That's why we pitched it to him, because we're basically a literary press, poetry and nonfiction. But this is so good. And we worked together with him on that issue. He did an omnibus, a composite essay. And so we pitched this. We liked the idea of a composite book, like whatever it is, 14 essays. Here's what he says about, and this is in a way all you need to know if you're talking with other people. So after all these I think it was at this point 199 footnotes, whether Israeli decision makers favored annihilation or expulsion, and whether they did so for reasons of deterrence, vengeance, or settlement, the policy upshot and practical bottom line was the same. Gaza was to be rendered permanently uninhabitable. Israel resolved to inflict what the IDF spokesperson termed a massacre that collapses the Gaza Strip upon its residents, and reduce Gaza, end quote, and reduce Gaza, as one Israeli defense put it, into a city of tents. We are now unrolling, quote, we are now unrolling out the Gaza Nakba, end quote. Minister of Agriculture Avi explained. The civilian population would be given choices to stay and starve or to leave. So that's what they've been doing intentionally. And as a result of that, they've been brought as a state party, not individual responsibility. That's set aside for the International Criminal Court. But the case of South Africa is presented before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It's with state parties who signed up to the Genocide Convention in 1948. Israel's a state party, South Africa is a state party, and they had the right to challenge another state. That's not holding particular people like Bibi or his defense minister.
That's the ICC, isn't it?
Yeah, ICC. Yeah. It's individual responsibility. This is state responsibility. And this is the key thing. I mean, if I can just continue, people are saying, well, they mix everything up. The court case in the front of the International Court of Justice is between states. It will take years to arbitrate. But having been actually in the siege of Sarajevo and gone to the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for weeks and watched these people. And eventually 2 people were convicted of personal role in genocide, Mladic and Karadzic. So it can be a personal responsibility. War crimes are always personal, like just executions, violations of the Geneva Conventions and so forth. And then there's another category, crimes against humanity, which is like structural, like using starvation, right? So the key thing for me as a writer and for a person who is spending a lot of time promoting Avi, right, book everywhere. I mean, the number of invitations is staggering. It's important to read what the Genocide Convention of 1948 states, and it's very quick. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, i.e., as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And this is the key one. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life
designed to bring about their destruction and
calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent the birth of within the group, like bombing maternity hospitals. So there's another one about transferring children. It's not quite relevant. So basically, I think that someone like Avi, who was very skeptical of the word, he never used the word genocide until Gaza.
It seemed like he actually went on a bit of a journey himself. Because if you read the older essays, he refers to Israel as a democratic state. Even says some slightly positive things about it if you read some of his older ones, but and the more modern ones, it's totally scathing, it's totally condemnatory.
So when we did the issue with him, he came to Ireland. He had an event at Imagine Belfast, and he had a couple of events down in Dublin, Smock Alley Theatre and somewhere else. And I remember sitting there, and people were going, "Oh, but Israel is committing genocide." And I remember him saying, "No, you don't need to use that word, right? It's bad enough as it is. Don't get it wrong. This is his, be precise, be exact." So in the back of the book, he uses a word. He says, we quote a passage. "I've always been skeptical of using the word genocide, but now, classical," and then he goes on immediately to say, "and it's also Zionist fascism." Now, it may not, he says, correspond to all the classical features of fascism. But it reflects enough to be able to describe it now as Zionist fascism, especially militarism. Then he goes on, yes, it was a democratically elected government, but so wasn't Nazi Germany in 1933.
Yeah, well, that's the excuse Israel always likes to use, and people who back it in Britain or Ireland, they always say it's a democratic country. It doesn't really mean anything. It
doesn't mean anything. Now it doesn't mean anything, but so wasn't Mussolini's Italy, and so wasn't Orban's Hungary.
It makes it even worse in some ways because, if you're a democratic country and you're committing genocide, it implies you've likely got a large percentage of the population backing it.
Yeah.
And in Israel's case,
that's what he says.
Polling suggests that around 50% of the population back the extermination of everyone in Gaza. So,
that's clear.
Yeah.
He says that the core Netanyahu government represents the center of gravity in Israel. He says that several times. And, basically he says that as an Arab Jew, I feel that it's my moral duty to make this small, modest contribution of whatever essays are here, he says, and at the hour of need of Palestinians. This is the hour of need. This is the enemy at the gate. The enemy at Warsaw. They want to liquidate the ghetto. But instead of just sending them somewhere and killing them, they're going to liquidate the ghetto by killing and expelling. And what I find so amazing, it's clear that the IDF is completely out of control. And they're just killing people because why? They want to kill people. It's part of the genocide. And no one ever asks on the BBC. I have a real problem with them now. Like, do you not just see that they want to kill as many Palestinians and expel as many as possible? Is that not clear yet? It's obvious. So looking at the convention, obvious. But there are all sorts of tricks in Britain, I have to say, GB, rather than Ireland. So that's what sort of animates me now, like appearing here. We need to make sure that this is a good thing that Ireland is very pro-Palestinian. And this whole thing, which I call the balance fallacy.
Well, it is important to differentiate between the Irish government, isn't it? And the Irish people, the policies of the Irish government haven't been
that good.
Haven't been great. Haven't been much better than Britain in some ways in terms of allowing use of Shannon Airport and
all that.
Trade with Israel.
But still, I say in this essay, which I wrote about the book and about my experience, a lot of what we've gone through, I'm kind of thinking, the Irish population has long been advanced of the government. The government is finally, the whatever you call the covers in the eyes have dropped. Scales have fallen from their eyes. So, but I'm kind of proud of being, I'm a dual national. I'm proud of Ireland taking probably the most pro-Palestinian stance in Western Europe, And, they're arresting poor Irish guys in Berlin and stuff. And here comes Kneecap, Fantastic. They don't understand Belfast black humor, that's for sure, So that's the book. I could read one other quote.
Yeah, if you just one short one maybe, and then we'll move on to the book's reception. Right.
So this speaks to me. Kathy, my Jewish girlfriend, Alex, my roommate at Harvard, Adam, my roommate in boarding school, and then Kenny Rubin, he was a real Jewish guy. I have no idea what he thought in Israel. His father made plastics in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I mean, this was just normal. Judaism was normal. It cannot be stated, here's Avi, often enough, that Zionism and Judaism are two different things. Zionism is a secular political ideology. Judaism is a religion. Zionist leaders, however, tried to co-opt Judaism in their struggle for a Jewish state. Although the Zionists did not believe in God, they invoked his authority as a land agent in claiming that he promised the whole land of Israel to the Jewish people. You can imagine how that rankles, certainly, a land agent. Yet the two groups adhere to fundamentally different values. The core values of Judaism are altruism, truth, justice, and peace. The government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, which authentically represents the center of Israel's political gravity, is the antithesis of these core Jewish values. The essence of Judaism is nonviolence. Netanyahu's government is the most aggressively nationalistic, ethnocentric, messianic, and violent government in Israel's history. Its aim is not peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians, but hegemony and domination. So when you hear self-defense, think that. It's not about self-defense. It's about domination.
By domination, expansion, yeah.
Because the clear question that you can even ask about Iran at the moment, do the Palestinians have the right to self-defense? Do the Iranians have the right? I mean, most states, it would be said, have the right to self-defense. What are they supposed to do? The Palestinians just supposed to stand there and take it? I mean, the discourse is so lopsided. And as Avi says, the problem with talking about the delusion of balance is that injustice itself is one-sided. There's one group that stuff is being done to, injustice. And you can't always talk about this delusion of balance. Whoops. So all these things are now interacting. Settler colonialism, self-defense, all the arguments. And in my view, this is going to break the West. The hypocrisy is so staggering now.
Well, if you're talking about scales falling from people's eyes, I think
Yeah.
people have started to see our own societies for what they are now as well. They've started to see our leaders for the thugs they are. They started to see how undemocratic our own societies are. And so that like
Exactly.
what you're talking about is a major shift in how people
I've been
perceive
radicalized by this, because I came from classic East Coast liberal society, and Sue Pentel, who runs the Ireland Palestine
might
Solidarity,
be on here at some point.
get her on.
Yeah.
And she routinely, when I'm talking, says, "Oh, those are the liberals. Those are the liberals." And she's not talking from a conservative point of view, obviously.
Yeah.
She's talking either Republican, Irish Republican, but she just says the liberals. And they can't square it like Jonathan Friedland,
Yeah,
the Guardian. They can't get unaddicted to this Israel, and even certain aspects of the American right are saying, drop Israel, because it can't continue like this. It's going to end up like Algeria, really bad. Million people killed. So
It's well on its way there.
yeah, obviously the Hamas issue is key to the whole narrative. Although I would say that it's easy, I don't have any problem with saying that Hamas did a pogrom in the old sense, but one pogrom doesn't justify another. 52,000 versus 1,200, right? And basically two rights don't make a wrong. That's basically what it comes down to. And like Avi, I totally disapprove of killing of civilians. That's obvious. But as Avi points out on the back of the book, there was a tsunami of vengeance and hatred that this triggered for obvious reasons that have to do with the Holocaust and so forth. But he says, and he concludes, but revenge, however, is not a policy. And we're seeing that it's running out of steam, or maybe it's not.
Not lawful either.
Yeah, so this is just about, I'll maybe read it later because it's so good, Norman Finkelstein and everything. It is no exaggeration to say that the whole of Israeli society was unhinged by the trauma of 7 October. The trauma unleashed a tsunami of hatred towards the perpetrators and loud calls for revenge. Revenge followed on a massive scale and out of all proportion to the attack. Revenge, however, is not a policy. When Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it turned a tiny enclave into an open-air prison. Israel's response to the Hamas attack of 7 October 2023, the incessant bombardment of Gaza by land, sea, air, turned this open-air prison into an open graveyard, a pile of rubble, a desolate wasteland. He goes on to quote, on October 7, the inmates broke out of the prison. In the words of Norman Finkelstein, the breakout was akin to a slave rebellion. Now that's a very good way to look at it. Like in Haiti, there was a slave rebellion. They were extremely violent. And other times and places, there have been slave rebellions. And that's basically a good way to look at it. Yeah. Finkelstein is correct in his image. It's a good poetic image, if I may say so. Yeah. So that's the final quotes.
So just moving on to then the books, how it's been received. Like you said, that there hasn't been as much attention, especially from the British press.
There's been no attention.
None.
Even though we sent at least 80 to 100 copies out for review, all the big ones, because we have a very good publicist in London, a specialist. She worked for Notting Hill Editions. Her name is Melissa Chevin, and she has a huge database. She rents it. And we sent out personalized emails to every single major editor, 5 of them at The Guardian, London Review of Books, to Michael Gove at The Spectator and his deputy editor, et cetera, endless numbers, even to the New Statesman, and we haven't got any reviews. That doesn't mean we're not going to get them, but basically total silence in GB, with the exception of a big website called Novara Media.
Yeah.
And they did an interview with him, and it's kind of convinced me that really the legacy media is on the way out, because they can't cope with this level of knowledge and double down media and so forth. Or Adam Tooze's chart book. He has 150,000 followers. They published a chapter Israel's Road to Genocide. And in one day, in 24 hours, we got about 120 orders that are just coming through on our website. So Jewish Voice for Labor, yes. Novara Media, yes. But they're sort of in the left-wing ghetto in England, nothing mainstream. We've just got a review in the Irish Times. We got a huge spread by Robert Macmillan in the Irish News. And there's been all sorts of other stuff happening in Ireland. So it raises the question of why.
Well, yeah, that is basically just the history of the two countries, isn't it? One has sympathy towards settler colonialism, and one has been the victim of settler colonialism.
Yeah.
That's
so it's exactly like Avi says. Ireland is a natural ally of instinctively, all anti-colonial struggles. Britain is a natural ally of settler colonialism, which Avi demonstrates in the opening chapter on the Balfour Declaration, is enmeshed in imperial thinking, and they seem unable to get over this addiction. They still have to think, we can't go against the Americans, because if we go against the Americans, they might, especially now with Trump, they might decide not to renovate our Trident missiles. Yeah. Because the Americans control the renovation. Right near where I grew up, Rhode Island. Partly I grew up in Rhode Island, New York. It's right in New London. We pass it all the time. That's if the Americans pull the plug on the Trident, that's it. It's over. So they're constantly, the British Foreign Office is enmeshed in this stuff. And it's not going to go away anytime soon, I don't think. So this split is very evident, but the sales are suggesting something else. I mean, 3,500 have lost track in like 3 months. Means that people are buying the book despite the opposition, despite the lobby. And we just think it's going to go on, continue all year as long as this, catastrophe unfolds as Francesca Albanese says, a tragedy foretold. I mean, people have been saying this for some time. So
it's too big to ignore. So even if the mainstream press are going to ignore it, people are going to want to find out the truth elsewhere.
Exactly.
So it's not
and they can see it with their eyes. They can see the Genocide Convention. They can see what it means. And one of the roles of writers and historians and intellectuals and just common citizens is to call it. It's not that difficult if you read the convention,
Think about how you'll be perceived in 10 or 20 years' time.
Yeah, exactly.
But just moving on, just as we're coming to the end here, obviously you're part of the Irish literary scene, and I think you want to talk a bit about how that has dealt with Palestine generally.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to get really sharp, close to home. So there was a huge burst of, protests right at the beginning of 7 October, within a couple months, and a group of Irish writers self-designating themselves as leading Irish writers. Some were, some weren't. Did a whole lot of events. To me and to my colleagues, it smacked of self-promotion and virtue signaling. So the question I ask is, where are they now? They did the big events. Needless to say, and I'm going to say this honestly because I'm an outsider with an American accent and clearly an immigrant of some description. I'm not saying I'm an unprivileged immigrant. That would be completely untrue. The north of Ireland has treated me very well. Ireland is my destiny. I have no complaints, really. But because I'm a bit of out with, as they would say in Scotland, of course, I wasn't interviewed. The guy who did the Islam in the West issue, no sign of it, even though some of these people knew me and knew about that. So this became a kind of hiberno-centric self-love fest. And it went on all around Ireland, and I haven't seen a single trace of any of these other people writing or doing anything. So publishing for me is a marathon. You do a sprint, like a couple protests and so forth, starting to seem to me heavily a kind of a sprint, a kind of virtue signaling with some people, a kind of lifestyle choices. Now, like yourself, like BDS, about Ireland, Palestine solidarity. This is the marathon now. Yeah. You know, the protests have dwindled, actually. Why? Well, people are probably, you know, dispirited, like we can't do anything anymore. But this is the time to keep pushing, like marathon runners right at the end. And
do more even. You know,
do more.
Do protests and.
Yeah, like you're doing, like you guys are doing.
Stuff, yeah.
BDS, I mean, it's really hard slog. And, you know, publishing is hard slog too. We work hard. We just don't, you know, we don't. I'll come back to, maybe it'll be the final image. I'll come back to the publishing as a form of ice hockey, right? Like in Canada. So it's now, we're in a really hardcore push period. And activism is extremely important for keeping the issue before political eyes because they make the calculation on support.
What do you think, like artists, writers? What do you think their contribution to activism is? What's the most useful thing they can do to actually?
Like Avi. They do what I call intellectual infrastructure. Before Avi wrote The Iron Wall, which basically briefly describes Jabotinsky, an early extremist Zionist policy, Israel creates an iron wall, crushes the Arabs, generation until they compromise. The aim of the iron wall is to get rid of as many Arabs as possible from the full land of Israel, which is early Zionists say, from the river to the sea. The main aim is to crush the Palestinian national movement, which even Herzl said, no people, and the Palestinians are a people, will ever give up their land willingly. So Avi's book, The Iron Wall, describes the quintessential theory of Zionism, which is to crush the Arabs and to finally force them to negotiate and settle, not for a state, but some kind of apartheid scenario, and get rid of as many as possible along the way.
The writer's role basically is to tell people the truth, and then it's a role of other activists to act upon it. Is that?
Yes. I think that Chomsky was the one who started talking about settler colonialism. I'm not a particular fan of him for other reasons. Maybe that comes from my father because I was in Boston when he was first making his appearances at MIT, and he's much of a muchness. But you know, on Palestine, he's good. He said that the aim of settler colonialism is the extermination of the natives.
Described as one of the most brutal and sadistic forms of colonialism.
Yeah. And so what do writers and thinkers do? They clarify and they evaluate. And that's what this book has done. It is the absolute deconstruction of the whole narrative of Zionism from a person who considers himself very much a Jew, who considers himself Arabic, whose first language is Arabic. And, you know, it just makes an assessment. It calls it. And, you know, writers have always done that. During the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, Polish writers, they called it. And as my quote suggests, it's not that difficult to call. I mean, the Genocide Convention put that clause in the intent to create conditions that will lead to the destruction of a people. They specifically put that in to deal with some of the things that Nazis did. They didn't just kill everybody in concentration camps and death camps. They marched them into the middle of nowhere and left them. That's creating. That's exactly what they're doing now. And the German publisher, who's a Jewish guy, who's doing our book in German, his father was a Holocaust survivor. He says, this Netanyahu government, I'm not talking about all Israelis. I have some friends now in Scotland. They're Nazis, basically, a new kind of Nazi. So that's what I think. That's what Avi thinks. And he was very skeptical of using historically the word genocide or fascism. It's just explosive to say Zionist fascism, which is on the back of the book, his quote. I mean, it breaks red lines. And it also is a major intellectual challenge to this British establishment that just is totally addicted to arms sales in America and the whole show. Sorry.
Final question here. So, obviously, you've done a major service towards Palestine by publishing this book. Is there anything the Irish Pages has planned in future for pushing Palestine to the fore? What's in the pipeline?
we've done one good thing, okay? As I say to my son, just do one good thing well. Don't, it's a joke, don't try to be everything in terms of Irish. Don't try to be a paramilitary, a poet, an activist, all this kind of stuff. Just do one good thing and don't try to diffuse it. So we've done one good thing. I don't know about another book. We don't need another book. This is the key infrastructure. And just to say something about myself, I'm extremely proud that we pitched it and we did an Irish book on this theme. And it has definitely gone global. I mean, with 11 different publishers seeking translations in Italian, Arabic, and so forth. I'm quite proud that we took a bit of a bet. You know, can we do this? We spent a lot of money. The book is we created a war chest, not with Arts Council funding, our own money. And we just did something, and I do believe that sooner or later you're going to see Avi on Al Jazeera reviews, because it's just, the book is unstoppable. You know, so I hope anyway.
Well, thanks very much for publishing it, and thanks very much for coming on today to talk to us, Chris Agee. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm glad we met yesterday. I'm sorry for going on so long,
No,
but
good.
it just came out, right?
Yeah.
Really great.
Thank you.
Yeah.